We're bringing together two worlds, but actually have deep roots of being together.
Solomon talks about a kind of channeling, which is direct access to the unmediated Word of God.
I didn't want to be a channel. I didn't expect to be a channel. I'm still surprised that this is what I do now. I was a college teacher for many years. I found that when I had my hands on people's bodies, I would hear things for them. What I see myself as is a radio.
And I would like to then bring my corpus, which is medicine work, which gives you access to information that's beyond the small self-desire.
Prophecy is not just a potentiality, it's the appropriate realization of every human being. These first-person channel voices in this engaging of the metacrisis, how could we possibly afford not to have them at the table?
It's the action of fear. The action of fear is to claim more fear is to claim more fear. Wasn't expecting that.
This is pretty spectacular, what we have going on here, because we have someone who has been deep in downloading the wisdom of Solomon and that ancient lineage that stretches back through time. And we have Paul Selig here, who is able to access fresh the wisdom of what he calls the guides and channel them. And so we're bringing together two worlds that have rarely collided in the modern time, but actually have deep roots of actually being together in the historical context. And I'd love to start by kicking this over to you, Rebbe Gafni, to actually talk about like the roots of this before the split and where the split happened, and then maybe even go into some of the stories that are in the biblical texts and in the lineage texts that actually talk about the role and the place of the channel and the prophet, and then how these worlds can come together now in modern times.
The way religion is classically understood is exactly as you described it, of course, right? There are these ancient texts, and somehow they speak through the ages, either well or not so well. Right? We try and update them the best we can, but ultimately they come from then and not from now. Mm-hmm. So the lineage of Solomon in its precise nature is about taking issue with that vision of religion. So there's an entire scholarship around this tradition in Hasidism, right, articulated by a master named Mordechai Leiner in the mid-19th century. He actually understood himself to be the lineage receiver of Solomon's wisdom. And the very core of the wisdom I can maybe express in one text. So he quotes the text, Lo al lechem levado yichya adam, ki al motza pi Hashem yichya adam. Not by bread alone will the human being live, but only through the direct word of God. So he says, you would think the Torah is the direct word of God. He says, no, the Torah is lechem, is the bread. It's the staple, but it's no longer the direct word of God. He says, Judah steps in, who's the ancestor of Solomon, and Judah accesses the Torah in a directly new and fresh way every single day. And yesterday's Torah is no longer the word of God today. And if Judah is clarified, which is a major notion, berur, he's clarified, then Judah's new access of the Torah overrides the law. Now you understand the drama of that.
Heresy.
The books were burned. Absolutely. These books were burned.
Yeah.
Many of us have heard the famous story that appears in the Book of Kings of the two courtesans who come to Solomon and each claim the baby. And so Solomon says, well, okay, let's cut the baby in half. Famous story. And of course, the mother says no, right? And he understands, right? Clearly he enters into the moment and he discloses from the moment what the truth is. So in the Jerusalem Talmud, they
So
point to,
for people who don't understand that, what Solomon was intuiting was that in that declaration, the actual mother it would be unbearable for the actual mother to imagine that the baby would be split in half, whereas the non-mother wouldn't have such a vociferous reaction.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. So in the Jerusalem Talmud, they say that the rabbis excommunicated Solomon for doing that. So we think that's a hero story. But actually, in the tradition, they excommunicated him because when you have a case, you go to precedent and law and previous cases, and you check what you're supposed to do. And what Solomon was doing is, and the reason that story exists is because Solomon is defying the lineage. If you read the Book of Kings, the authors of the Book of Kings sideline Solomon because Solomon talks about a kind of channeling, which is direct, immediate access to the unmediated Word of God. So that's what's so paradoxical. Now, that has to be in relationship to a broader ethos, to a broader body of work, of sacred texts, which are filled with ethos. So you're in relation to it, but Solomon says you override it. And I'll just give you one more text that we're all familiar with. Everyone listening to the podcast will be familiar with this text, right? There's a time for peace. There's a time for war. There's a time to throw stones, a time to collect stones, a time to, to make love, etc. So this text by Solomon, which says there's a time for everything under the sun. So the masters challenge that text. They say, well, what do you mean? We have the Torah, which gives us normative instructions for what to do, how, and when. And Solomon is saying, no. There's a quality of time that has its own intrinsic nature that invites action that is not legislated by the law. And Solomon is actually introducing this subversive idea that if you step into the quality of time, the time itself is an organic living quality that discloses a direct channel of revelation that's not available in any other time. The lineage of Solomon is about the democratization of the channel. Right? That channeling is not only a possibility, it's an obligation.
So when I put Marc and Paul in a room together, Marc offered the insight that many of these religious teachings that are the foundations for the big religions were actually channeling experiences that we called prophecy. It's a fascinating topic, so dive in.
In the ancient world, both in the lineage and in all the other religions, basically everything happened through someone claiming first-person knowledge, essentially. And now we're getting to someone said, I heard a voice. And they were powerful in some way. They brought people along. And then people said, oh, you heard a voice, we trust you. And you're hearing a voice, we're with you. And we know, of course, some of those voices were absolutely real and some weren't, right? But it was a first-person claim that actually created a second-person reality, which became the church or the mosque or the synagogue, right? But it was first-person claim. The temple in Jerusalem has the Ark of the Covenant. In the Holy of Holies of the temple, there are two cherubs who are sexually intertwined in the lineage above the Ark. And then the voice that we hear comes from in between the sexually entwined cherubs, meaning value, the voice of value comes from the love story. Very beautiful. So the whole temple is based on first-person voice. Either it's the priest or it's the prophet, but it's always first-person voice. It's always a first-person transmission, right? The fire, it's a miracle, right? It's a first-person transmission. It's always first-person voice. The temple is destroyed. At the moment of the temple's destruction, there's a move from essentially first-person voice into the scholar erotic mystic. The scholar erotic mystic is the one who says, all the books are holy, says Akiva. The Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs is Holy of Holies. And the Song of Songs is Holy of Holies because it's a love story. So the love story becomes central. Eros, it's an erotic love story, becomes central. And then it becomes central because it's a text. It's love poems. It's a text, and texts become sacred. So the voice of Eros from within the text, mediated not by the prophet, but by the aflame scholar lover, becomes central. There's this enormous move to marginalize the first person voice. Let's marginalize the channels, which is how the Hebrew wisdom survived the exile. So we need actually a text that holds us together, where we all can enter the text, and it's kind of a blockchain text, meaning everyone participates in its interpretation. It's actually the original blockchain, which is the voice of God interpreted by human beings who are reading the text, and they're involved in a hermeneutic process. And so, when one rabbi or one master says, right, I'm channeling, and I'm going to make miracles to show you I'm channeling, and the other master says, no, we don't accept evidence from channels, we don't accept evidence from miracles, only the full immersion of Eros in the sacred text from the clarified, purified scribe or master, and it's democratized. Anyone can become a master. There's no hierarchy. Only that creates new gnosis. But underground, Kabbalah are channeling. Right? So as the Talmud's happening above ground, you've got this underground world of channels.
And now we're back to the podcast. So I'd love to kick this over to you now, Paul, to talk about, there's many different ways that you can access unmediated contact with the divine or representatives of the divine. You're primarily clairaudient, meaning that you hear actually the words of the divine. But if you want to cover like the grounds of clairaudience, claircognizance, how you work, what you've seen in the field, because you're very aware of not only what you're able to do, but kind of the contemporary landscape, and also maybe even touch, if you like, on some of the pitfalls of this as well. And that can maybe open up Marc's conversation about berur, which is the clarification of both your desire and the channel itself. But let's kind of lay the groundwork for channeling a little bit.
I'll do what I can. I was somebody that actually didn't necessarily believe in channeling, and I'm still skeptical of a fair amount that passes for channeling, and I think a lot of it's very well-intentioned. I use the word channeling in a very specific way. For me, channeling is dictation or stenography. And so my job as I work is to take the words as it comes. And the guides I work with have now dictated 13 books through me that are unedited, maybe 3 words in a volume that I mispronounced because they speak very fast sometimes. But initially, I was very wary and very reluctant. I didn't want to be a channel. I didn't expect to be a channel. I'm still surprised that this is what I do now. I was a college teacher for many years. When I started to open up as a clairaudient, which means clear hearing, it was always in deference to the needs of others. It was not for myself. At the height of the AIDS epidemic, I had studied a form of energy healing, and I found that when I had my hands on people's bodies, I would hear things for them. And then they would prove it out. If I heard the name Jeffrey when I was touching your chest, and they said, that's my partner's name, my father's name, my dog's name, and all this energy would move, I began to trust that I was actually tuning in. Right. So a channel for me, and what I see myself as primarily, is as a radio for a broadcast. When I'm working with my guides, they're the station that I'm tuned into, and they are directing the transmission. And my only job is to keep up with it. When I work psychically, I tune into perhaps you as the radio, and I hear an aspect of you that would be in broadcast, but I don't think of that as channeling. I think of that more as clairaudience. Now, channeling, as I understand it, is direct communication. It's not a voice in the room, and this is where people get mistaken about clairaudience. It's like, who's talking to you and where are they in the room? For me, the very first voice I heard was when I was 25 years old, and I was struggling with addiction, and I asked myself what I could do that day that was positive after I had started praying for the first time in my life, because I was raised an atheist. And a voice came and sort of pierced my own thoughts with a level of clarity that I could not have imagined and I couldn't deny. And the guides have said, there's a real difference between thinking and knowing. Knowing is claircognizance, true knowing. And that, I wonder, is if that's perhaps not what you're referring to when you say everybody's a channel, because everybody does have that access to their own innate knowing. Channeling for me is a skill set that was developed. I seem to have been sort of set up for this in some way and really sort of trained over years. So channeling now in the culture can mean many, many things. I channeled a poem today. I was with my boyfriend and I channeled what I needed to say to him. And I think that that's inspiration. And I think inspiration is valuable. I think all great art is inspired art. And that is getting out of the way and allowing what we know or our intuitive nature to come forth. But it's not necessarily about going elsewhere for the information. My recommendation for most people who say that they would like to channel, I always say, why? Why do you want to do this? It's actually never gotten me a date. It's not terribly sexy. I mean, if you think about the court stenographer, this person is sort of sitting there typing up a storm and becomes invisible. I interrupt the channeling often when I'm confused with the teaching, which makes me more present perhaps than others. Edgar Cayce would go to sleep and he'd be out cold, and Jane Roberts was a trance channel. I'm reseated when I work, so I'm climbing into the back seat of a car and turning the wheel over, but I'm still listening from the back seat to make sure that there's some logic present, because otherwise I would have to interrupt it because I'm confused. And I want to be at least able to agree with the logic that they're coming forth with, even if it isn't in agreement with what I personally would think. The different clairs are present. Clairsentience is the other way that I work, and it's another way to get information. My two primary abilities are clairaudience, which is hearing, and clairsentience, which is feeling. Right. Now, we live in a culture now where everybody calls themselves an empath. Right. And, everybody has empathic abilities. And I think that there are degrees of this. Yes. I said to somebody yesterday, you tend to know what other people think about you before they say anything. You can feel it. And you can feel when something isn't right. And the way that our systems and our senses work with us, I think, are in support of this. When I work as a clairsentient, I actually step into people and feel what it feels like to be there. So I'm the only guy that I know that's ever had a hot flash. I know what it's like to be pregnant, which is freaky. It's like a radioactive zucchini in my abdomen, and I don't know what to make of it, but that's how I know it's pregnancy, because it's foreign to my biology. It's this other experience. But what these things have actually shown me is the level that we're all connected. So if I can step into somebody that I've never met and feel what it feels like to be them, or know their pain or their suffering or their sense of separation, I have to be able to recognize that in myself as well. And we move into a kind of communal experience of being.
Here's an example of Paul Selig tuning into an individual to actually work with that individual's energy and also tap into that specific knowledge, which is another one of Paul's gifts.
I've been on this journey of repairing time and some of my history and looking at some of my shadows. And I was adopted at birth, and my mother never held me. And it's been kind of coming up in this process of touch through some other work with a friend who kind of pointed that out. That was a big moment in my life, obviously. I'm just wondering if you have any information about my birth mother. I've never met her.
Without a name, probably not. I can tune into you at a higher level. But usually I use a name as a coordinate. It's like the pin on the map for me.
Sure.
Just that I know where I'm going. But can I have your whole name, please?
Brent Bolthouse.
Let me just tune into you. You do show up looking, which is curious, but you show up looking warily. It's like I'm walking into a room and I'm looking for somebody, not sure if I will be recognized when I go. Do you have a name for her?
I don't know. The records are sealed. I've never had access to that.
Let me go to your. Did you have an adoptive mother?
Yeah.
Let me go to her just to see how I'm how clear I am with this.
Yeah, her name's Linda.
All her names?
Linda Benkendorf Bolthouse.
Let me see if I can get her. Is she living or crossed?
She's living.
Good. This is a smile, but this is boundaries. So she shows up smiling, and this means boundary, 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 boundary. And it's a wide boundary, but it's really good. So it's like, okay, everybody, you're welcome, but this close. This close is the energy. I go from her to you. Yeah, well, she can't give you this. She cannot give you this. I'm not even sure how much she might want you to have it, to be honest. And I think there's some pain at you not being hers around that, which this would almost confirm. You actually, I don't like to do predictions. I actually think you may find this. I'm going to see if I can feel anything without a name. Just say your first and last name one more time.
Brent Bolthouse.
Did they give you a name before you were adopted?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. See, I feel somebody, but I don't hear them. Now, sometimes when I don't hear them, that means they just don't have a body, truthfully. And sometimes it's just there's nothing to tune into. Because when I feel her, I feel, I'm going to use this, nicely ordinary, sweet, and a little lost. This feels like a situation where somebody was asked to give somebody up. This feels like that. This feels young to me in that way. Like somebody sort of acknowledging what they're supposed to do. There's no, interestingly, when I feel this energy, for lack of a better word, there's no sense of rejection here at all. At all. It's the feeling of more like somebody who goes, okay. Like, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do, okay. Like following instructions. Let me just tune into you beyond this, around the issue, if that's okay.
Sure. You have my permission.
So the opportunity is to find yourself without this. And that's actually a little bit revelatory for you. You're like, huh? The interesting thing with you, because you're sort of looking around you like everything's kind of remarkable. Like, look at the world. With a little bit of how am I here? Like the deal was you got to be here. Like that's the big deal here. You got to come. That was choice. And I don't know what it is, but there's a big reason for that too. This is not like, so what? It's not one of those experiences. I hear about the birth mother that she's finished. So that I think that may be a finished piece. That's what they're saying, but I don't know what that means. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
And now back to the podcast.
The guides that I work with are teachers, and it's funny because you mentioned the word, and I began opening up as a clairaudient at 25. It wasn't until my mid-30s when I split with mentors and teachers, and I was just on my own and terrified, that the guides actually brought through what they called the energy of the word. And what I heard, which was odd, for days and days, was Jerusalem Bible. I kept hearing it in meditation. I said, what the hell's... this is before the internet. You couldn't just Google it. So I went into Shakespeare and Company across from NYU where I was teaching, and I said, is there such a thing called the Jerusalem Bible? And indeed there was.
There is.
And I took it home, and it's the translation. You would know this. I didn't. But it's not the King James Version. It's translated from Aramaic. It's very clear. And I sat down in bed, and I said, well, what do I do with it now? And they said, read John aloud. And I read the book of John aloud over 2 nights in my underwear sitting on my bed. In the beginning was the Word. And the guides brought through the energy of the Word in their teachings, and they called the Word the energy of the Creator in action. Or the one-note song. The one-note song, which they say is in manifestation, is all things. All things seen and unseen are of this one note. So my process has been the stenographer for a teaching that I suspect I longed for personally. I wanted to know, once I went from living in a world where there was no such thing as God to one in which there might be, and then was given a couple of experiences of some magnitude that made it impossible for me to doubt, because I couldn't. They were sort of physical, palpable experiences, that I said, well, if this is real, it makes everything else pale in comparison.
Yeah.
The life that I thought I was supposed to live was somewhat derailed. And I became, I guess, a student of the guide's work myself. Yeah. I don't think of myself, truthfully, as particularly special in this. I just think that I was developed through an ongoing willingness. But part of the key was that it wasn't going to be about me and what I want. It was going to be me showing up for an instruction that was ongoing, and it's now ongoing through the text. The first one was channeled in 2009. They just finished the 13th text last month. So I don't know if I'm answering this in a clear way. I'm trying to give you sort of a broader framework. The New Age is really interesting, and I think we live in a time, and I'm not a good New Ager, and I really never was. I'd been through too much. I was broke. I defaulted on my student loans. I was nuts when I was a Yalie, and suddenly I was like, how the hell did this happen? And I'm sitting there, in a 12-step meeting on Times Square at midnight going, how the hell did I get here?
Yeah.
But I did. And that was a democratization more than anything I've ever been through in my life, was to understand the communal experience of being lost and seeking to discover something beyond the known. And so when I think about the work that I do, I think of myself in service to something I may never understand. The New Age, though, likes to make things special. And now you can watch a YouTube video and suddenly you have a shingle up that you're a healer, you're a prophet. And while we all have these potentials, and I actually believe we all do, like, I'm never going to be 6'5" and drafted on a basketball team. It's just not who I am.
Paul, I want to go back. Let's go back to, is this an okay place to,
this is
it okay?
Yeah.
Now, within the lineage, though, there's this surprising, esoteric, very deep teaching, which is the realization that Moses is a first channel. Mm-hmm. So actually, the 5 books of Moses are the Word of God. Mm-hmm. And we got to chat a little bit the other day. It gets very, very clear in the 5th book, because the 5th book begins with, these are the words that Moses spoke. And so the lineage says, well, what do you mean? This is the word of God. That's the whole point of this. This is Devar, word, Adonai, of God. So why are these the words that Moses spoke? Is this Moses speaking or God? And the response is, there's 2 essential responses. One response is, Moses got so empty, there was so no Moses around, he so removed himself, he so nullified himself, that the divine could flow through him. Mm-hmm. So he had become a clear channel, and the description is dictation. Mm-hmm. He's a stenographer. The exact description in the 3rd century is Moses is taking dictation. And so as you talked about it over the weekend, that's the precise description of Moses in that mode. But then there's a second description, right? And it's interpreting the text, which says, Shchinte dabre mipume de Moshe. The Shekhinah, the voice of she, speaks from the lips of Moses. And then the esoteric interpreters go on to say that Moses, Moshe, 3 words in Hebrew spelled backwards, which is not a magic trick, but it's one of the ways of disclosing gnosis. Moses spelled backwards is Hashem, 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 which is the name. Mm-hmm. And the name means what we would call, Aubrey, in our discussion, we would call unique self. Mm-hmm. And by unique self, we don't mean my talents. Mm-hmm. We don't mean my gifts. We don't mean the gifts of my separate self. We mean that my separate self has stepped into true self, meaning I realize that I'm inseparable from the seamless code of the universe. And then I realize it's seamless but not featureless. Mm-hmm. And I'm its unique feature. Mm-hmm. And I have a unique voice. And if I clarify that unique voice and I fully inhabit it with nothing left out, I am so fully Moses that my infinite radical Mosesness, my infinite unique subjectivity collapses, in the best sense, into God. Mm-hmm. And so Moses writes the Torah because he realizes his ontic identity of wills with the divine. Moses' will and the divine will, and will is an eros word, right? Will is in Hebrew ratzon. Ratzon, will, and ratzon means from the Song of Solomon, draw me after ratzon, I will run after you. So will means the place, let's say, in classical sexuality, when you're no longer deciding if, maybe, could be not, we're sort of in, we're not in, and you've crossed a line, you're in, right? So that's not a giving up of will. That is in the right place in the right time, a higher will that descends and animates me, and I'm filled with desire, and desire is a form of channel. And its desire itself is a quality where I'm filled up, I'm taken, and if that desire is clarified, it comes out in voice. So Moses is Ish Elohim. He's the erotic unioned partner with the divine, and he's so Moses, he's so fully himself that he becomes a prophet. But it's not just that he knows, but he does know. You're right. The word knowing is beautiful, and knowing is an erotic word, and Adam knew his wife Eve. All knowledge is carnal knowledge, but he actually speaks the word. So last piece, so the Zohar, right, Book of Radiance goes on to say, It Moshe b'kol dara, Moses is in every generation, and Moses is in every person. So what it's inviting is, this sense of this voice in the original canon which says, Alavai shekol ha'am nevi'im. Would it be that everyone was a prophet, right? And this notion that actually prophecy is not just a potentiality, it's actually the appropriate realization of every human being. And indeed, in the ancient world, there were schools of prophecy, which tens and tens of thousands of people would gather, right, in order to clarify their prophetic channel. And that prophetic channel created a kind of unique self-symphony, this music in which everyone was in the same broad symphony, but everyone was playing a unique instrument, and everyone was accessing an actual voice. So but that doesn't mean that everyone's going to become a channel. It means that part of a person's personal practice, if they clarify it, meaning not they read the artist's way and they're doing the white pages, right? In other words, so I think you're correct. In other words, the reason I talk about this rarely is because it's so easy to do a new age hack of it, right? To do a human potential movement hack of it, and to kind of assume, right, here I am, I'm God, I'm a channel. No, actually, channel is a very, very fine, refined skill, right? And it's a rare set, and it requires, as you've done, Paul, in your form of channeling, or as I've done in my form of scribing, channeling, and writing the new story, the truth is it requires a lifetime of commitment and decades and decades and decades of absolute focus and giving an enormous amount up. It's not a hobby. It's a full-on, but it is a possibility.
I've always been a collector since I was a kid. Whether it was sports cards, magic cards, comics, stamps, or coins. And as I've gotten older, I've transitioned to collecting original art. I also believe in precious metals as one of the safest and most stable stores of wealth. The impossibly cool thing about my new company, MetalMark, as part of the Aubrey Marcus Collective, is that it combines both of these things that I love. Fully assayable and recoverable fractional gold notes, paired with impossibly beautiful, cool, and collectible limited edition art. So if for some reason you don't like the art anymore, or the art loses its value, you can always just keep the gold. If any other class of art loses its value, all you are left with is paper, or in the case of NFTs, pixels. And if you are just starting in collecting gold, instead of having to drop $2,700 on a coin like this, you can get in for less than a Benjamin. And I would like to then bring my corpus into this, which is the medicine work. 25 years I've been in medicine work. And from my first encounter with a medicine journey, which was a psilocybin and MDMA journey when I was 18. I came in a radical atheist. I believed there was no such thing as spirit. There was no such thing as soul. There was no such thing as God. And I was here on this planet to prove that there wasn't. That was my purpose. I was a new Christopher Hitchens, and I was God is not great. I'm going to tear this motherfucker
God is not
down.
great.
I'm going to tear this down. Right. That's what I came into.
Wow.
That's what I came into the journey with. And then I had a firsthand experience of what I could only use the word soul to describe, separating from my body. And I felt the difference between spirit and body and how they were connected, but also that there was something more that included and transcended the body. And I was up all night in this kind of feverish writing by a fire in this little clay hut out there in the mountains of New Mexico, just writing and writing and writing and reinterpreting my whole understanding. And I've followed that thread. Now, the medicine path gives you access to information that's beyond what your mind. I didn't come in with any belief that this was possible, then I got something. But if I go back and I look at those texts, they weren't exactly accurate compared to what I know now. So in the many, many years, so you could say, oh, there it was. I got a prophecy. I understood.
Right.
No, actually I didn't. I was still filtering it through my own, what's called the hermeneutic prism. Hermes, the god of communication, this way in which we interpret things. I wasn't clarified enough, and I didn't have the body of knowledge to actually interpret the information correctly that was coming through.
Yes.
So the word, the one note of truth was coming through me, but the way I was able to form it, I didn't have the structures as it filtered through to filter it in an actually clean way. So go fast forward 25 years, countless, thousands of medicine journeys of different types since then. That's helped. But also what's really helped is studying the wisdom tradition. So I learn new things from, Tibetan Buddhism, of course, our deep study of the wisdom of Solomon, or even the guides information and channel, or even talking to someone like Nassim Haramein, talking about like the kind of radical edge of quantum physics and understanding that. And then I go into the medicine journey and information appears slightly differently. So my study of all of these traditions actually makes me a better channel. And it's not that they're necessarily direct contradictions, but they actually flower in a different way where I understand the world slightly differently. And I think this is one of the caveats is someone does their first ayahuasca trip and they're like, I got it. I got all the information. I'm like, no, you got some information and you will probably always hold this, the germ of this,
yes.
the dendrite of this, the dendrite of this information will have truth that you'll be able to point back to, but it will evolve over time as you evolve your own prism and your understanding, and it will illuminate more. And also you'll start to be able to clarify, as you were talking about, clarify your own desires. How much is my separate self personal desire to be special? There's a separate self desire to be special. The separate self I call the player. So, okay, if you're a basketball player, how do you know you're a good player? Well, you look at your stats compared to another player's stats. Who's the best quarterback? I don't know. There's a quarterback rating. There's a MVP voting at the end of the year. There's a salary that you get. There's all kinds of metrics by which you can measure. And a player desires to be comparatively better than other players. That's the nature of the separate self. It's separate and it wants to actually has a drive to rise to the top and be the best player that it can be in the game that it's defined. So that's the personal separate self, or what you would call, and the guides would call, the small self desire is specialness, is betterness. But then you step into the true self where you recognize we're all children of God. We all hold the monad. We're all part of the one word of all creation. And then you recognize that this is all just a very small, finite game in which you're playing for this, and that there's a bigger game. And that's where your unique self emerges, which is like, okay, I am able to translate word uniquely through me. So my poetry is only my poetry, and only I can write that poetry. And that poetry is uniquely valuable to the world. And my thoughts are uniquely valuable to the world because of my unique prism. And it doesn't mean that it's the most accurate, but it is mine.
And not as an egoic, as Paul and I both talked about yesterday.
Right.
And it's not an egoic play because the ego works very hard to hijack the unique self. Mm-hmm. It's not an egoic play. I'm actually in devotion and I'm commanded by reality to give my unique gift to the world and not to distort it. So I'm not supposed to be channeling books like Paul. It's not my job. It's Paul's. So therefore I get to meet Paul and I get to be madly delighted. Because that's right. And in other words, we get to be madly delighted and create unique self-symphony when we actually get that this unique gift you're describing it takes all of us. And that is the purpose of my life, right? We can actually end the life purpose conversation, like all the confusion. The purpose of my life is to be me, but not in a kind of superficial follow the bliss way. It's the radical joy of Aubrey being so Aubrey, right? So Moses, right? That actually his radical, infinite personal subjectivity explodes into an ontic union with the divine, and he can give gifts. And then it recedes, and then he's, then all this stuff comes up again, and then, right? So anyone who thinks they sit in the throne for more than a minute, right? There's a moment, right? There's a moment, and then there we are on the floor again. Yeah. But this is right. And just last sentence, and to you, Paul, right? This is such a unique moment, right? Where we have kind of this world of Solomon lineage and new story of value, this deep world represented with such pristineness, right? By you, Paul, of channeling, and Aubrey kind of being, this deep master in the world of medicine. So we're having this moment where the channel meets the Dharma, meets the medicine. And this is a conversation that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. And in the, this is what some of the dream of that is a memory of the Renaissance of like what happened when these different schools got together. Even Solomon himself, who, and you can tell the story better than me, but he's slandered for having 1,000 wives. But what that meant, as you've transmitted it to me, is he got to know all of the priestesses of all of the different mystery schools of the time, integrate all of that wisdom into himself. And then that's what we're doing. We're actually learning and integrating and getting to know each other so that our own work can be better informed by the knowledge and by the openness, by the willingness to receive from our peers.
Right after Paul, I'll expand on that. But I'm just dying to hear what you're thinking and what you're saying.
I mean, there's a lot been said, so I kind of don't know where to enter into it. I think you and I are actually saying the same thing. I think some of it's semantics. I think the guides use a different word. You use unique self. They use true self. But they talk about the appropriation of the personality structure in the higher octave. It's not about the ego being destroyed. It may be about a dismantling of aspects of self or personality that are destructive, or what they would suggest, I suspect, would be that diminish our own ability to be expressed as the true self. So the image of the lantern that's been tarnished being cleared so that the light can broadcast more fully. So the process that they take their students through these texts, and I don't think they're done yet, which is shocking to me, because every time they finish one, I think, well, there's nothing else to say, and then there seems to be a lot more, is the alignment at a higher level. They call it a higher octave. They say we're operating in a collective field that they call an octave with its low notes and high notes, which you can think of evil and grace, whatever you want to say. And then there are octaves beyond this, and they're aligning us to what they call the higher octave, or the upper room, which they've described as Christ consciousness, where they say the energy of fear doesn't express. And then when we stop making choices based in fear, we stop replicating a history that has been so steeped in fear that we don't even see it. We've come to think of fear as our ally, when in fact they say it's actually not. It's a liar. So what they're promising, I suspect, through the teaching is indeed experiential, which is so funny. Once Aubrey had me on his podcast the first time, all these kids started showing up at my events, and they would say, once the guides would start doing energy work, they'd say, this is what I experienced in ceremony, or this is like what happened in plant medicine, and it's happening here in this energetic conversation. So what the guides seem to do is want us to have our own experience of the divine. I actually don't think that what I do, if it ever endures, will probably be more than a footnote of a time when people were showing up in channeling. Occasionally, and I totally agree with you about the importance of history, I'm not schooled in this. Once in a while, somebody would read something to me, and I would say, is that the guides? It's beautiful. It sounds just like them. And they'd say, no, it's Spangler. And I go, who the hell's Spangler? But it was somebody else who was teaching at another time. And I actually do believe that truth is truth. And the guides have said that in truth, which is the energy of truth, not a subjective truth, guides say most of you call your opinions your truth, and you all have opinions, but they say what is true is always true. And they say in truth, a lie will not be held, it will not endure, it cannot last at the level of vibration that truth holds. So I think we're actually all saying the same thing. And I'm actually personally pleased because it's not a conversation that I get to have. Yeah. And I actually don't know a lot of what other people channel because I buy everybody's books and I don't read them. And I think the reason I don't read them is because I don't want to be informed by them. You sure you know this, but you'll hear everybody suddenly is talking about, there'll be a buzzword, a jargon word. It may be the divine feminine, which my guides talk about too, but suddenly became part of the zeitgeist. Everybody's talking about this, and I meet these guys. I'm trying to discover my divine masculine. And it's like, well, what does that mean? It means how to be a better man. Does it mean integrating the active principle more? But I think these things exist, and I think that they're useful because they allow for a conversation. But I was not privy, because I was raised without anything, without a lot of prejudice, except I thought people who prayed in restaurants looked stupid when I was a kid. You must be in one of those states where people do that at the Cracker Barrel. But, that's not how we lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So
no, absolutely. And of course, it's strange how we met in this shared circle. I was, of course, raised deep within the lineage, but a lineage that was read in a particular way. Right, in a very classical way, which has great beauty and depth, but ultimately can't take us to where we need to go. And in some sense, and Aubrey, you were raised kind of in the world in which you were on the one hand an atheist, on the other hand, your father had a deep sense of the importance of medicine, and he transmitted that to you, and actually, in some strange way, initiated you into that, in the old world, the aristocratic father would send his son to a brothel, right, to kind of get educated in the sensual. Your father send you, I don't know if he did first.
I would have said yes. If that was the plan, if Dad said it.
But instead he sent you to a medicine journey, right? And, and Paul, you're raised in this kind of materialist context. And you studied the world's literatures. You were a teacher of playwriting, right? So you were about the kind of the story of the world and all the nuance and subtlety and depth in that. And I had to rebel against the lineages, right? And try and listen so deeply that we could actually begin to create something new. And so that before, I just want to address one thing that you said, Paul, but before, just going back to what Aubrey said. So there's 3 moments that I'm aware of, well, 4, where this happened, and it hasn't happened for hundreds of years. It happened in the Solomon moment. So Solomon's 1,000 wives, as Aubrey says, are understood by the Solomon lineage as his, and he builds 4 other temples in Jerusalem that people don't know about, they don't talk about, but they're actually in the text. So he's trying to convene this huge conversation, and he's ahead of his time. He's he's ahead of his time, and he gets written out. The text says he's straight after too many women and too many chariots and, too much power. Maybe he was driving a Porsche. I don't know what was happening, but you know what I mean? He just says, so Solomon was ahead of his time. This convening of this great conversation was too early. And then you go, if you kind of fast forward, right, to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and everyone goes to Alexandria. And Alexandria becomes this massive center of learning where you have kind of early discoveries of almost all of the sciences. You have this universal moment, which is quite beautiful, and this flourishing of Alexandria, the great Alexandria in the 1st, 2nd century that gets destroyed. In other words, Christianity in its zealotry, right, in its non-refined dimensions, closed down Alexandria, just like Solomon in a different way was kind of shunted to the wayside. And then it appears 2 more times. It appears in Constantinople, actually, which is sacked by the Crusaders. But Constantinople is filled with this incredible learning from all over the world. And yet it always remains esoteric. Constantinople is sacked. Plethon from Constantinople goes and meets Cosimo de' Medici, right? And, and Marcello Ficinio And we talked about, Pico della Mirandola, right? And Da Vinci, and they begin that conversation of the Renaissance, and that births, right, the best of modernity, the dignities of modernity, and also, to the extent they got things wrong, the disasters of modernity. And really what we're saying is that we need to reconvene that conversation, not just because we want to be the fullest human beings we can be, not just because we want to be aligned with spirit and truth in that deepest sense, but because we will experience the death of humanity. Right? We're literally at this moment of metacrisis where if we don't tell a new story of value, we actually won't survive. And what I got so excited about the first night that I could actually not even sleep well was that, these first-person channel voices, they haven't had a critical seat at the table, right, in this engaging of the metacrisis. And how could we possibly afford not to have them at the table? Right? So we're saying third person, a new story of value, second person, sacred community, right? Love, eros are all second person. First person in the ways that we're kind of, as it were, channeling the new texts, but that's a different kind. It's a unique self-channeling. It's not, it overlaps with it. It converses with your mode of channeling, but they're obviously utterly distinct and both utterly necessary. They're not even vaguely redundant. And so it feels
and
like
adding to the table, the medicine word.
And I was about to say, and now the medicine, right? And now, so now we have the medicine, we have the new story of value, first principles and first values, and we have this unique form of a first person voice, which is different than this democratization of prophecy or enlightenment I'm talking about. It's a different form of first person, which is critical. And we've all known that it's out there. Like I remember growing up, Seth, I remember Jane Roberts, right? You remember hearing, you remember Course in Miracles, and I would have arguments with my friend then Roger Walsh, who was a big proponent of the Course in Miracles. And I said, Roger, I don't think so. And even when we did this one mountain this morning, where we talked about some of these issues just because I was here, so I got a few notes from people in our circle saying, why are we talking about channeling? Like, why would you talk about that? And so I really spent one mountain answering that question. And I'm so delighted to learn from you and to share what I can and to learn about medicine and to share what I can. And in this kind of, last sentence, this truly, if we can kind of access what the lineage calls tikufot, which is a beautiful word, which is this radical true humility, not a feigned humility, not a knee-jerk, like a radical true humility, which is completely identical with a radical audacity. Where I get to be like madly delighted to meet Paul, not like nice to meet Paul. Oh, nice, right? No. I get to be excited. And oh my God, he's holding a whole body of knowing and way of addressing cosmos, and I can feel right. And we both would have known immediately if like this doesn't work, we would have just. But that wasn't the case. It was like, oh, this is good. So I get to be excited. I don't have to be polite. I get to be excited about reading the world of medicine. And when we did our first journey together, we said the medicine needs the Dharma, and the Dharma needs the medicine, and we need the first person channel, and there's a new trinity that can actually create something new in response to unimaginable imminent suffering. So it's not a meta-theoretical. It's like fuck, right? Like we're faced literally with an endpoint at civilization that we've talked about in great depth. So I won't rehearse and reinitiate, but oh my God! So this is a huge, beautiful moment.
Yeah,
which gives me hope.
Now here is a taste of the conversation when Paul's guides first encountered Marc. The energy felt a little tense. There were some bright points of distinction. So tune in and see what you can pick up.
They said when you were speaking, they said, we're not going to do it the usual way, right at the top. So. Which is out of my comfort zone, but, I'm also terrifically shy, which people don't know. So get me out of my comfort zone twice, bring me to a house full of people and ask me to interact and then do something new. This is going to be quite the day for me. So keep these handy. But they're saying they'd like to begin. So I'm assuming this is conversation as opposed to they're doing their thing. They're saying it will be a bit of both if we have our way. So I have questions for you based on what you were talking about. And they keep saying we would like to begin.
So I'm going to have to see what we're going to say. We have several things to say. They're saying we have several things to say about what we discovered through this interaction, the idea of the divine self. The idea of the divine self, or the aspect that knows, or the aspect that knows, was actually not discussed. The intellect was discussed. The intellect was discussed and highly prized. While there are many ways to work, and many ways to understand the light, and many ways to understand the light that indeed you are, we must address the fact that the world you exist in, that the world you exist in will not be healed through the mind, as it has been condoned in a superior way. Indeed, what a channel is. Now, indeed, what a channel is, in a true way, is an intercessor, a medium or media between two levels of consciousness. You rightly say that the disbursement of the first person to the collective, into the collective through the writing, and the scholarly application of the that have accompanied it, have in some ways lost the first meaning of the truth that was spoken, We must say finally that there is only one truth, underline only, everything you said is completely accurate at one level of tone, but you will not fix this with the work of your hands, but the work of your hearts, with the work of God, by any name you want to give it, it really matters not to us. It really matters not to us, which is the idea of all things, beyond a name or a condition, beyond all things, beyond all ideas, there is this one thing, this ever-present present everywhere, that is present in every breath, in every sunset, in every tear, in any intercourse, of the body or the mind, God simply is. It is. We have much to discuss with you. And we thank you for listening to us, and we thank you for listening to us. We are honored for the opportunity to speak, when we are not lecturing through him, period.
Well, amen. So permission to discuss, just keep the discussion, right? Is that just...
Correct.
Okay, so in the word intellect that you, and I speak to you, to Paul, and to the guides, and to the you, and to the holy presence that's in the room. So the one is in speaking for humanity's yearning, right? The one is the one heart. The one is the one eros. The one is the one field of value. So intellect is a voice of voices. There's an eye of the mind and there's an ear of the mind. But we speak here in this story of value, right, of not the eye of the mind. The eye of the mind is the garb sometimes, but the music is at the very center, and the music is the music of the heart. The universe feels, and the universe feels love. The desire, which is she, that moves in we, that you spoke to so beautifully, right, lives at every octave and in every tone. It feels like it is a moment where we desperately yearn for and therefore need to articulate and speak the new tone, and the story and the moment are one. And how do we bring this story together, right? What are the missing pieces, right? So madly delighted, the Lineage of Solomon, to be in this table with you as we together serve the wider field in deep devotion and honor, and so madly honored and so madly delighted and so madly alive in this conversation, and so madly open, right, in the sense of madly, in the sense of true insanity, which is the only sanity, which is the one eros. What is the beginnings of this weaving together?
abandoning the idea of story would be highly useful now, because you rest upon the old, your idea of beginning, middle, end, your idea of beginning, middle, and end, even the idea of the hero, even the idea of hero has been deeply tainted with an idea of what should be, with an idea of what should be. When you release the idea of story, you stop manufacturing meaning, and you stop manufacturing meaning through an intent to tell a certain kind of story, what is simply is, and the innate divine that is present in it, will begin to speak to you, you'll be more conversation, you will move into a conversation with the holiest of holies.
And now we're back to the podcast. So the direction I want to take this now is to continue to talk about pick up the thread of the caveats here. So we talked about one of the caveats, which is you haven't clarified your own prism. You have some of your own desires or some of your own traumas that are interpreting some word that's coming through. That's really so that's super important to clarify, to know that your prism is playing in this. And that's one of the reasons why you're saying you're not reading all of these other books. You're trying to keep your prism as clear as possible. And one of the reasons why I respect and admire you so much is because I feel the clarity of your prism and the purity of your heart that desires the best for all of humanity that actually comes through. So it's not that actually you're not doing what you want. You are actually, I would argue, doing what you want at the highest level, which is your monad, your Christed self, desiring the best for all humanity. So it's the best of you desiring the best for all, right? And so that's why you're a clear channel. And you also have that you're always still a little skeptical. If the guides say something and you're like, I don't understand that, you'll interrupt the guides, and the guides will say, the young man is now interrupting us in the chair, and we'll get back to that. But you're always keeping that skeptical eye. And I think that's something that's super important. And where I'd like to take this is a point that is very misunderstood in the biblical texts it's the binding of Isaac story.
Aubrey, that's a great place to start. The binding of Isaac story, and let's just recapitulate the story briefly. It's this, father and son camping trip that doesn't go well, right? In the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis, Abraham hears this command by God to take his son.
By God, quotes.
Right. Well, let's hold right. Foreshadowing. Right. By God. Right. I'm going to erase the quotes for now. Right. But by God quotes, and as the text, as understood, it says Ve'Elohim, Elohim, the God. Right. As a Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning, God created. Same word. Right. Ve'Elohim. So we don't know there's quotes there. Right. But so yes, absolutely. Right. So Ve'Elohim, and God, Nisa'at Abraham, raises Abraham up, challenges him, speaks to him, and says, go take your son, your only son, the son that you loved, bring him to Mount Moriah, and v'haleu sham la'olah, and offer him up there as an offering on the mountain which I will show you. And Abraham takes his na'arav, his two servants, he takes his son, they get to the mountain. Isaac at some point realizes something's askew. He says, ayeh hasel la'olah. He says, we have the knife, we have the wood for the fire, but where is the lamb for the offering? Says Isaac. And Abraham says, probably with somewhat of a tremor in his voice, right? And Abraham says, Elohim yer elo hasel la'olah b'ni. God will show us, will see for us the offering. And he's about to, as it were, offer Isaac up. And an angel steps in from heaven and says, don't stretch out your hand against the boy, right? And he sees, Abram raises his eyes and he sees a ram. And he says, okay, this is the ram. I'm going to offer the ram instead, right? And then in response to that, Abram becomes the chosen one. Right? Because he has, and the way it's understood classically is because he has been willing to sacrifice. He's been willing to respond to the divine command. And someone like, for example, Kierkegaard, and anyone listening, just pretend like you read Kierkegaard. Don't look around. Just say Kierkegaard, and everyone who watches you, listens, is going to say that's great. So Kierkegaard is a Danish theologian, a brilliant figure. And Kierkegaard, classical Christianity, says this is the example of what he calls the teleological suspension of the ethical, meaning I intentionally suspend the ethical in direct obedience, right, to this actual experience. When he's having a palpable experience, this is the word of God. And that's the text has been classically understood throughout history. And indeed, there are an enormous amount of parallels in the New Testament to the walk of Jesus, to the crucifixion, to the binding of Isaac's story. It's the same fundamental story. It's the story of sacrifice and offering up. The only thing is, that's not actually what the text says. So one day I'm reading the Zohar, which is a 13th century document, Aramaic document, and it is in a passing reference, it is reading this text, and it says, Velohim, and God, right, turns to Abraham, and it says, Velohim, da Yetzer hara. This is the evil voice. So this is not a liberal Protestant reader of the text. This is the lineage itself speaking, saying, this voice, Elohim, that's anti-value. That's sitra achra. That's the other side. So how could that be? So what's happening to Abraham? So if you look at the story of Abraham, Abraham had a father. And Abram's father, Terach, actually in the lineage tradition, there's a very well-known story for those who know these stories, where his father brings him to Nimrod, who's the king deity, and he's thrown into a furnace of fire. In other words, he's offered up by his father as a sacrifice to God. And Freud reminded us about repetition compulsion, that I go to do what my father did to me, but I don't realize I'm engaged in repetition compulsion. I'm pretty sure it's the voice of God. And so Abram hears this voice telling him that he has to sacrifice his son. And the reason the story becomes so stunning is because Abram is able to clarify the voice. So the Zohar says Abram hears ba'aspaklaria de lo nahara in an unclear prism. It's called an unclear speculum. And then Abram is able to go deep inside and to find the part of him that recognizes authenticity. He's able to disambiguate the false God voice and actually realize that the real God voice is the one that cries out and says, don't cast out your hand against your son. And the last piece is, it's in the body, right? The angel says, Al tashlech yadcha, don't cast out your arm against your son. So one of the masters, again, in an elliptical text that never kind of gets anywhere, says that actually the angel was his body, was his arm. And that's his arm, his physical embodiment told him, this is not right. I'm not supposed to be doing this. And he listened to the voice of the divine mediated through the prism of his sacred body. And this then becomes the model because it's about taking responsibility for the God voice. This is the text which says, you can't actually say, God commanded me to sacrifice my children. You can't actually, in other words, it's the ultimate challenge to fundamentalism. Right? I heard the God voice. No, you have to take responsibility for the God voice. And are you hearing through an unclear prism, which is mediated through voices of trauma, right? And pain and lack of resolution and inability to get the blessing of the father or the blessing of the mother? Or am able to clarify the God voice and actually become Abraham? So Abraham becomes Ibrahim. He becomes Abraham because of his capacity to take responsibility for the God voice. And so it's a critical text in terms of channeling and in terms of just where we are today in the world. I mean, maybe last sentence. You remember seeing pictures of Osama bin Laden? You looked at his eyes. He would be such a good teacher at Esalen, right? Osama bin Laden would give a great Esalen seminar. His eyes were burning. And in our State Department, which was so profoundly secular at its core, didn't actually understand religious experience. So they dismissed him as essentially a charlatan, right? You know, hijacking religious experience for the sake of political goals, right? No, he was actually having religious experience. And if you actually look at the circle around bin Laden, there were some incredible human beings. His daughter-in-law was a social worker, et cetera, et cetera. It was not a clarified prism. But you can't even begin to engage bin Laden unless you understand he's having an authentic religious experience. And he knows he is, and everyone around him knows he is, and those eyes are on fire because they're really on fire. And he didn't take responsibility for the God voice, right? And he then turned into a person who was willing to take the Twin Towers down, however that unfolded.
I'd like to take this to something that's really personal for me, because there's a personal vector to this conversation. My father around, and this will probably be a little bit emotional. My father around 2008, there's a whole story of the reasons why, but ultimately he was, to summarize the story very quickly so you understand some context, he was one of the most renowned commodities traders in the world. And this was in the pre-computer era. So the computer was your brain, and you were the person with the sharpest brain that could synthesize the most information and understand pattern recognition as a singular self, as a brain, was able to actually be incredibly effective in trading the commodities and futures markets that were emerging. And so, he's chapter 1 in Jack Schwager's Market Wizards. He was a pioneer, and he had great clout and renown, and he was able to accumulate, a great amount of wealth because he was the best. He was like the best poker player or something like that at the time. Well, then computers come along, and it's not about a singular brain. It's about how to work with the collective brain of the internet and the Internet of Things and big data and all of this information. And he never made that leap to become a master of computers. He was still trying to operate as his brain against other brains that had actually fused with this computer learning. And so he lost his edge. And so, that was deeply painful for him, because his love for himself, his self-identification, was wrapped up in this ability to perform and do what that's how he knew himself as in his greatness. Now, I could have told my dad, "You're a great dad. Like, I love you so much." But that wasn't quite enough for him. And potentially this is reductionist in some way, but this is a thread of understanding to the best of my ability kind of what happened. But he found a book that said, you can get direct information from the angels. And the book laid out a step-by-step guideline for how you get direct information from the angels. And my dad wasn't particularly spiritually gifted, even though he was, diligent and on the medicine path. He would apply dedication rather than, it wasn't like naturally gifted, I would say. So he started doing these meditations where he would try to hear the words of the angels. And he was really trying under the surface to get his edge back. He was trying to get his edge back. And so that's not really, and as you know from the guides don't give a shit about that type of stuff. They give a shit about self-actualization. So the actual angels aren't going to tell him anything about the markets. They're going to tell him about his soul. But that's not what he was looking for. He was looking for something else. So at this point, I'm still young and still early on my path, and I go through some of these meditations, and I don't kind of really hear any. Sometimes I get little pictures that come in that I translate or something, and it seemed pretty kind of eccentric, but, harmless. Well, then 2010, I'm on my first ayahuasca journey, and something snapped, and this started to come up. It started to get a little bit more uncomfortable. The voices started telling him things, all things associated with specialness. Because none of the market information would actually work out. So it wasn't working out that way. So the vector of specialness started to shift, and he had started to develop messianic kind of ideas about, I could walk into a children's hospital and I can heal people, or I could do this type of thing, which gave him a sense of specialness. And then all of a sudden, when I was on this trip, something snapped where these voices that had started to come in, and he was hearing voices.
Something snapped in your dad.
And something snapped in my dad. The voices that came in all of a sudden became more real than his normal realities and faculties and thinking. And that was the moment where, a deep, rift happened. And I flew home as soon as I heard. And it was a very painful and dramatic scene where my little brother was scared. My stepmom was scared in the house. I walk into the house and the person before me, it gives me chills now. I have goosebumps just talking about it. There was some other spirit that looked like had taken over his body. And he looked at me, and we had such a loving, beautiful relationship, played golf and chess, and he developed my mind. I would sit on his lap as we'd go over charts of things. And it was a beautiful relationship with my father. My father, just to give you how much he loved me, he had a big sciatica problem with his back where he couldn't actually even walk or sit or stay like in any kind of vertical position for a little while. And I was playing basketball at the time, so he would talk to the people at the gym about allowing him to have a little mattress, a little twin mattress that he'd bring in the truck, and he would lay down in the near the stands to watch me play basketball because he didn't want to miss my games. Like, that's how much he loved me. And I walk into that house, and he demands that I kneel before him. My father demands that I kneel before him and give him fealty. He used exactly that word. He said, I demand you give me fealty. And I said, Dad, I can't do that. He said, you're my dad. I love you. But I can't do that, Dad. And this carried on, and I kind of held my ground. And ultimately, at that point, my family was scared. And so, I agreed that it was time to actually involve the police. So we let the police in, and, Dad runs when he sees them. I hear the sound of the taser going off, and I hear my dad scream, and then he gets taken into the mental institution at that point. And so I know that my father was hearing voices, and I know that those weren't the right voices. Right. And so what I would like to do here, and this is going to be very kind of vulnerable and personal, but I think it'll actually give you an opportunity to kind of tune in and give the people listening an opportunity to tune in, is to just see if the guides would like to share anything about, what happened with my father and what those voices were that kind of came in. And obviously I know that you don't have full control of when the guides show up, but if they are able to just kind of speak on that, where those voices were coming from, what those voices were, and kind of what happened in that moment.
Okay. I'm so sorry that this happened to you and to him. I've run into these things periodically in my life, and I know that they happen, and I think that there are different reasons, but I'm going to actually go to you first. I may go to your father and then the guides, because I don't usually talk to people on the other side, but I usually get them as they were when they were here and still had a body. And if the guides want to say anything, perhaps they will. Okay? Let me just go to you first. So you come through like this. You're literally shaking around this thing and covering your mouth because you can't speak it. Give me his name, please.
Michael Phillips Marcus.
What I hear from this, and I wanted this so badly, is what he says. I wanted this so badly that I let this in. It literally is like somebody who's pressing their body against a closed door, trying to call in something that would give me what I wanted. And I actually think he did. They're saying low field. That's what it is. So this is astral stuff. Say this. They're saying to say this. So, there's an old writer, Emmett Fox, who was writing in the 1920s. And he wrote a book on the Sermon on the Mount, and one of the things he addressed was the claim, and lead us not into temptation. What kind of God would lead us into temptation? Why is that even in the Lord's Prayer? And what he said is, it can be the desire for so much so soon that you don't have the discernment of what you're calling in. I want the big experience, give me the big experience. Well, we can get them. We really can. I'm going to go to you again with this. I'm going to say this. You're saying this is the worst experience that ever happened to me, and it's because of this that I do what I do. And this is, you need to know the truth. And you have to be careful and maintain discernment. They're saying low level. So I say this to people that want to channel, because I think it's important. Just because somebody wants to talk to you that doesn't have a body does not mean you listen to them. There's a lot of stations, a lot of internet channels, Just because it's available doesn't mean you listen. If the desire that's prompting this is, I would suggest, I'm going to say ego-based, well, that's not the right thing. Give me what I want and give me what I want now, and I need this. You're actually, I suspect, opening the door to what can meet you at that level. So the few things that I say to people about this kind of thing is, if there's flattery involved, if suddenly you think you're going to walk on water and all of this stuff, or you're being told this, chances are you're listening to low-level stuff. And the other thing is not listening to fear. Mm-hmm. The problem I have with some of what goes on in the community around channeling is people are bringing through fearful messages that are divisive, polarizing, and condemning.
And this was also, just to pause you right here, and I want you to continue, but the other aspect, it was both, because he had not only these delusions of grandeur, but also he was sending out to all of our extended family gas masks because the Krakatoa volcano was going to go off, or whatever the one is in Iceland or whatever, and something, there was always some new Armageddon around the corner, some new disaster that was happening. So it was both fear and then also this kind of inflation. So it was both, actually, is what he was experiencing.
I had a friend, an old-time medium, Jeanette Meek, who used to say, I see those people walking down the street talking to themselves. They're not talking to themselves. I'm seeing who's next to them. They're having this other experience.
Right.
And I think in 12-step literature, there's an important line: going it alone in spiritual matters can be dangerous. And because of this, I've always had somebody that does what I do, that I respect, that I can check things with. And I also think this is equally true.
Yes.
I don't think that a high-level guide is going to tell you what to do. There's going to be an innate respect for free will. Yes. And I took a break from channeling in my mid-30s, around the time of the Heaven's Gate suicides, and I went enough with New Age stuff. I wanted nothing to do with it. And it wasn't until the guys that I work with predicted 9/11, and only because my ex at the time wanted to know if his business in Lower Manhattan was going to make the rent in October. And the guide said no, because there's going to be a terrorist attack in Lower Manhattan. It's the only way I got that information. I went back to work the moment downtown opened up again. And I started to do my group, and like that, I'd stopped for 2 years. And I trusted them and their information. So any guide that's teaching in fear is a low-level energy that you don't attach to. Because if you attach, there's got to be something for these things to attach to. And that's when you're talking about the wound and the prism and all of that stuff. Now, I'm wounded still. I'm aware of many of them. I've done an enormous amount of work, or undergone an enormous amount of transformation as a result of what I do. But I also have learned to step out of the way to allow what is true to come true. And I'm very aware when something that is mine wants to color it, and then I get pushed aside. Mm-hmm. But I want to go back to you to see what you might do with this, if that's okay. Yeah? Mm-hmm. You're saying I need to forgive my father. But you're saying for not knowing who he was. Mm-hmm. And that's the forgiveness. And they're saying, this is the guides, because now you may know for him. That is the gift you have. This moves beyond time. To know the innate worth and divinity and any being in any being is not contingent upon having a body or a timeline or a timeline where you're intersecting where you are intersecting. When you lift to this level, there is no time. There is no time in prayer. There's no time. In prayer, there is no time. In divine recognition, no time, period. They're saying period.
You know, I had a very, and again, 25 years of medicine experience. And one of the pitfalls of having that much experience is you can get a little careless. You can think, I got this covered. I know that I would never advise anybody to go into any significant journey on their own. Don't do it. You don't have to be with a shaman, but at least be with a sitter. Be with someone who can be there with you if things get a little awry. I know that. However, I'm Aubrey fucking Marcus. I got this shit. So everybody, empty house. I just watched the first debate. No, it was not the first debate. I think it was the debate. It was one of the presidential debates. I think the debate between Kamala and Trump. And
you watched the debate right after Holy of Holies. And it was right after.
Right.
That's right. It was
so
that night.
It was that night. So it was the Kamala Trump debate. And I was just very disturbed by the state of the world. And, you know, I don't need to go into the details of why I was disturbed, but it was highly disturbing to me. And I saw my energy was off. The house was alone. I was like, all right, I'm going to go into a journey. I'm going to try and clarify my thinking and get my energy back to a centered, grounded place. And something that had never happened to me in this way before, an energy came into me through me. And I didn't do the normal protections. Although interestingly, I put on this particular red belt that I was gifted by this lineage, which is a sign of like an initiation. It was like an initiation artifact, but it wasn't a protection artifact. It was like, for whatever, I don't even know why I did it, but I put on this red belt. And it was also, you know, on the backside of some very beautiful, you know, Bufo journeys led by a beautiful shaman. And that was the one who gifted me the red belt. So there was some correlation with that. And for anybody who's also, another great important rule is after a big Bufo journey, there can be reactivations. There can be ways in which the medicine shows up. You shouldn't be doing any other journey. I broke my own rules. I broke the traditional rules, the rules that actually exist for a reason. Now, I love challenging the rules. You know, I love being like, well, is that real? Is that rule something that's fresh for new interpretation? Has this been frozen in a dogma, or is this something? So I love challenging the rules, but some of the rules are there because they make fucking sense. And I violated these rules. And I had this encounter with an energy that felt very similar to what my father's energy that he experienced was. And so I had enough sense, and I was riding this where there's enough of me still there that knew, that was aware that I was being hijacked. Although the interesting part of being hijacked is you become the hijacker. Like I was like, the entity that came in me was also me, which was confusing, but there's just enough of me to realize the disambiguation between the hijacker and the hijacked, which was me, but I was this energy. But I had enough sense to call Vailana, who is out in New York, and I get her on the phone. And one of the practices that I use to ground me into who I am, I know who I am in truth. I know what I am in truth. I know how I serve in truth. That's one of the things that I do. I am here, I am here, I am here, a claiming of the divine self. Another one of my practices for that is to claim my own sacred name. So I am, and then there's a series of names that declare myself on multiple octaves. So I move in the physical octave of the separate self, and then I escalate in the octaves, the octave of my potential, the octave of my soul/oversoul, and then the octave of the angels that are like the kind of distillation of that oversoul all the way up to the divine plane. So she asked me to do this, and it starts with I am. That's how I start this whole thing, you know. And she's asked me to do this, and I go, okay. And I'm fighting, and I'm wrestling with this energy. And I say I, and I can't say am. I can't say am. And I go, I, and I can't say am. And I just start screaming. I go, I, and I can't say it. And then I just howl. and into the night, in just this pain and frustration that this thing is blocking me from even saying the second part of this, which even starts the process, which is I am. And we have this giant crystal in my backyard. She guided me to go to the crystal, which was a really wise move. And I went to the crystal, and the crystal's vibrating. It's this giant silver quartz crystal, a huge point in my backyard. And the crystal's vibrating, and she just put your hands on the crystal. I have my AirPods in. I had enough sense to be able to do that. And the crystal starts to hold and take some of this energy. The being, the entity that was in me didn't want anything to do with this fucking crystal. And I knew, like, all right, I got to get to this.
Yeah.
And and the energy started to move into the crystal, and then more of me started to come, and I sat down and put my back against it and slowly came back to myself. And in that moment was the deepest moment of humility for me, and also a lesson of the dangers of whatever these processes may be, that it was a real cautionary tale and a real moment of humility that even this could happen for me. And on the back side of that was the first time I think I've been able to find genuine forgiveness from my father.
Right.
Because I went and I looked at a photo of him and I said, Dad, I get it, man.
This is what happened.
It happened to me too.
Right.
You know, and when I could say, Dad, I get it. It happened to me too. I forgive you, Dad. I forgive you. And so it was a real gift, and also a terrifying encounter. And it's really been, it's kind of like a shot that across the bow, like a whiz across the ear, and I'll never forget that. And so, I mean, there's a lot of dangers in this, so one, we want to infuse the excitement of the potential of unmediated contact, and also remind people of the dangers.
I mean, the story, and to hear it again, and of course we went through that death portal, with your dad, and the guides being part of this just adds and deepens. If we were to offer people what we've offered ourselves, so how do you navigate? So on the one hand, we're saying oh my God, right? Oh my cat, right? On the one hand, we're saying oh my God, there's this enormous potentiality here, and that we need somehow to fulfill it in some deep way. And there's this deep invitation. And at the very same time, we're saying that the cat is going to go on a little trip down. We're going to go on a little trip. Kiki, going to help me? You're so sweet. Could you help me? Yeah. You're awesome, sweetie pie. Thank you so much. Right? And it was a sign. So on the one hand, we're inviting people, and yet naturally what's coming up, and it's actually how this is a great conversation, that the caution, which also comes from mad love, right, is coming up. So how could we formulate kind of the way that that you're in the right place and on the right path? And I want to just, if I can, bring one of my teachers is Levi Isaac of Berdichev. And, most of my teachers, pretty much all of my teachers, have passed, about 150 years ago, which I guess gives you a little more latitude for better or worse. And he was this incredible master. I actually have I was reading his text yesterday on Yom Kippur, right in the room. And he had this stunning voice, and he was a great realizer of early versions of the kind of the metaphysical metacrisis, if you will. So he was an initiate who viewed his role as doing soul ascents, accessing the right voices, and he wanted to climax history, meaning he wanted to use the purity of his heart and his ability to enter in the Hechalot Elyonot, the upper rooms, quite literally, and in order to reconfigure history through his pure heart, and actually, as it were, in the language of the lineage, bring the Messiah, meaning end suffering, right? Usher in this kind of new possibility. So it's Yom Kippur, which is the day we just passed, and he has this voice and he has this capacity, and he spends 25 hours in mystical movements in the upper worlds, and it's now the last prayer. And it was funny, we were talking yesterday, and the fast ended at 7:03, and I drank something, and I was just dying to eat, but we were so deep in our conversation that the hunger, by the way, disappeared, and we talked, I think, for another hour and a half kind of into the night. But it was that moment that we were at last night. It's called the Ne'ilah service, where the gates are closing, and he's literally in the highest ascent, and he's literally a moment before opening all the gates, and there will be no, it's the end. We've realized the new Jerusalem, the new world. And he somehow is aware, right? He feels out of, the side of his body that there's an old man who, because just like we did last night, he got excited. He's like 40 minutes after the fast is over. And this old man desperately needs a drink of water. So he stops. He doesn't enter the ultimate room, and he climbs all the way back down. He ends the fast, and he goes to get a glass of water, and he gives it to the old man. And when I heard that story, I couldn't stop crying for hours. It's like, oh, right? Like we don't trust voices that override our need to give a glass of water to whoever's suffering around us. Right? And it's that deep knowing. And that's the way we stay in. We stay in because we're responsible to the people we love. We're responsible to people's suffering, and we hold that, and we listen, and we never get so caught in the clarity or even the ecstasy or even the urgent need that we stop getting glasses of water. And that's maybe a way to know, am I in the right direction? Right? Am I still getting glasses of water? This moving me to get more glasses of water, right? Or it's not. It's deadening me in some way. And maybe that opens something for people.
You know, I'm often told, that the action of fear is to claim more fear, and that every choice I make in fear gets me more of the same. And they say to people, look at your lives, look at the last choice you made in fear, and see what it got you. And generally, it's just more of the same. And it's an easy way for me to try to have a compass for my own choices and my own behavior. Yeah. And if my fear is if I don't go up here, I'm never going to have this opportunity again, I'm acting in fear. Do you understand? If this is the only chance I will ever have, and then I've created a stingy God, and who needs that? You know?
Right. Yeah. That's actually a beautiful read of the story, right? That somehow we somehow think it's this moment, and that moment will never return again. And yet, if I can just and complexify things for a second, and Ob's one of the reasons, and I want to just, if we can, and I know, Paul, you share this, give you a compliment. One of the reasons I stepped out of my world of teaching and began public podcasting, particularly and only with you, was your willingness to complexify things, right? Which is, and we can't, without that, there are moments when you probably shouldn't come down and get the glass of water. So let's just make it even right. And there are moments where this is it. And so how do you discern between that moment where, like, oh my God, right? Everything is on the line. Everything else is off the table. I need to do this. And between the moments where I need to come down and get the glass of water. And that discernment, in some sense, we spend, I think, our lifetime clarifying our interiors and practicing and ritualing and studying and doing shadow work and doing work with everything we need to do in order to become that aspaklara denahara, that, in your language, that clear lantern and the clear speculum, right, that shines, that's able to, in that moment, make the choice and to make it well and to trust the depth of that choice in that moment, right? And Elijah Dessler, right, says very beautifully, just loosely translating, he says there's a point of choice, and there's the choices of all of our lives that lead to those moments where we choose and where we take our unique risk and everything's on the line, and we either come down and give the glass of water, which is the ultimate act of our lives, or we don't. And no, there's no guru or teacher, no Solomon lineage with permission, no guide, right, as you've articulated, who don't give you that kind of normative direction, that's the place where you have to actually be committed to being your own prophet. And you got to spend a lifetime becoming that, right? And you don't get to say, well, it's just my life. Just my life. Fuck you, it's my life. Well, fuck you who's saying that. Why do you think it's your life? Like, why do people think it's their, like, you didn't decide where to be born and when to be born and what kind of person you were born into or any of the context of your life. So if you didn't decide any of that, why do you think it's your life? Right? We're being lived. And we're given this crazy gift of life in order to be God in those choices and to love it open and to blow it open. And if you will, to fuck it open, meaning with all of our energy in a way that uniquely no one else but us can do. And it's only if we take that unique risk. And in the end, no one can tell us, right? But we can't trust ourselves unless we're madly committed to a lifetime of crazy joy service. And we need to expand that from a few to actually a world in which there's a new human and there's a new humanity. It's not, with all due respect, our friend, Yuval Harari, who's touring his book Nexus, which comes out of Homo Deus and Homo Sapiens, which is basically this human being who becomes a god through technological power, but there's no field of value and there's no voices that are real. There's only a short lifetime where value is made up and there's oblivion. So from that kind of writing, right, we're not going to be able to raise up a new generation. We have to actually invite people into becoming homo amor, right? This new true God self, this new being that is, and that's what I mean by the democratization of channeling. Not that people should be doing Paul's guides. They can't. That's not their job. That's yours. And I'm so excited to be with you in this. But everyone has an absolute radical, and I want to use a crazy word, obligation. Right? I mean, it's to be a mad lover is to be obligated. I'm obligated to refine my channel and to clarify my desire so that I actually become a unique resonant instrument for the divine. And that is the utter responsibility of my life. And responsibility means I respond to the field of value. I respond to my irreducible uniqueness. And that's what being alive means. And I mean, if there's any chance of throwing away the Prozac, right? I mean, that's where it starts, with that sense of radical fullness and eros in clarifying my God voices and being their incarnation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the other side of any action taken in fear is bound with fear and going to create more fear. Similarly, any action taken in genuine love is going to bring more love. And so one of the guidelines is this action coming from love? What would love do in this moment? If I am the unique incarnation of love, what does love do in this moment?
That's homo amor.
Yep.
What would, right? It's like the Christians, say, and I love it. They say, what would Jesus do? Right? And that's beautiful. What would Christus do? Yeah, it's beautiful. And you were talking about desire. My deepest heart's desire is God's desire. I've got to clarify, but my deepest heart's desire is God's desire. And knowing my deepest heart's desire is everything.
Yeah. I'd love to open this up. We're kind of coming to a close here, and the guides have worked through a little bit to talk to me about my story, but just love to open the floor to see if they have any message that they'd like to bring through on this podcast, given that the listeners will be listening, et cetera.
Okay. So for anybody that hasn't heard me before, I whisper and repeat. So I'm not just muttering. It's how it comes through. It's helpful to know that, because people are adjusting their volumes and thinking
That's
it's
hilarious.
worse than it actually is. So I'll see if I hear anything. We'd like to say several things. We would like to say several things. The first about the idea of who you are. The first is about the idea of who you are, and you second guess yourselves, and you second guess yourselves. Your humanist is present. Your humanist is present in your divinity, and your expressions of the divine, yes, and your expressions of the divine, yes, just as you are, but but to realize this, which actually means to know it, which actually means to know it, is to claim it as your own, is to claim it as your own. We cannot do this for you. We cannot do this for you, but the recognition must be there. But the recognition must be there. There's only birthright, that this is not only your birthright, but your inheritance, to claim your divinity. To claim your divinity, somebody say, I have the right to be, is to simply say, I have the right to be, and then allow the will itself, that aspect of you, that aspect of you that chooses to align to the higher will, to align to the higher will. It is a braiding that occurs. It is a braiding that occurs. The personality structure with its wants and wishes, in the divine self, and the divine self that knows far more than you do, at this level, that can support your choice, in a braided fashion, The braiding is important to understand. The braiding is important to understand. We would like to clarify it for those who are confused. We would like to clarify it for those who are confused. Imagine you have a rope. Imagine you have a rope that ties with a rope that ties with another rope. They become one rope. They become one rope. It becomes one will. It becomes one will and one perfect expression that will support you, in the highest choices available to you. You're always in choice. You are always in choice. The world you see around you, is a reflection of collective, choice, and that's important as well. And that's important to understand as well. You like to think of the self. You like to think of the self. My creations, my world. My creations, my world. But you share your creations. You share your earth and your sky. You share your earth and your sky in common languages. Invested with meaning. When you lift to the higher level tone, when you lift to the higher level of tone, or higher expression, you understand your responsibility. You understand your responsibility as of the whole, and you know not only in your hearts, but in your fullness of experience, that God must be present. By any name, in anything you see, You can't have it both ways. God is where I say it should be. And it cannot be there, While you exclude God from your choices, you exclude a high outcome. When you exclude the divine, anything you see, you claim it in darkness. What you claim in darkness calls you to that darkness, and you have a world now, that is seeking to emerge from shadow. But this happens through you. Through your awareness, through your alignment, your claim it's possible, and your claim that it is possible is impossible. It is not only possible, it is true, and what is true is always true, We are not making you holy, we are not making you holy, you already are, you just deny it, Thank you for your presence, period, and there's saying period.
Amen.
Shah.
Any final words you'd like to offer here?
Yeah, maybe just to close in the way, of the lineage. There's a Paul Ab, there's something they call Masemer Kavah, the account of the chariot, or the story of the chariot, in Ezekiel and Isaiah. But they say that telling a story, the story of a teacher of a master, that is the new account of the chariot. So just a very short story about one of my teachers, Menachem Mendel of Kutsk. And by the way, if you're planning to have children, it's not a good name, right? And so he was kind of good friends with Isaac Kevorkian. So they're complex names. They're Eastern European names. And they had a deal. They were very, very close, that whoever died first would come back and tell the other what's actually happening, in the upper worlds. So Isaac Kevorkian dies first. And Menachem Mendel's waiting for him to come back. And of course he doesn't, and he's not there. And so at some point, Menachem Mendel can't bear it anymore. So he says, I'm going to do a soul ascent. I'll go and I'll find out where he is. So he ascends, and he asks, he comes to the palace of King David, and King David says, we saw him here, but he went someplace else. And he comes to Solomon's inner sanctum, and Solomon says he was here, but he went someplace else, and to Sarah and Rachel, and everyone directs him towards this very thick forest. So he goes into the forest, and it's dark, and he hears kind of almost on the other side, he hears an ocean, right? This like an ocean. So he gets out to the other side, and he sees his best friend, Isaac Kevorkian, standing before the ocean. And he says, why didn't you come back? And he says, Shah. Right? Quiet. He says, listen. Right? Shashta, listen. So he listens, and he says, Gewalt, Gewalt, Yam shel Demaot. He says it's an ocean of tears. And Vorke says to him, these are the tears of all the people who've been in pain, who died with their stories incomplete, who died unable to get justice. And I said to God, I don't want your heaven. I don't want your ecstasy. I won't accept any gift from you until you agree to dry up all these tears. So may we dry up all the tears. Amen.
No greater intention than that deep bodhisattva vow.
Yeah, may we dry up all these tears.
May we dry up all these tears. Well, thank you to both of you. Wow, that was incredible.
Wow.
Thank you for this whole weekend. Thank you for this podcast. Thank you for your mastery. Thank you for your support of my life and those that I love. Truly, myself and my family wouldn't be as healthy and strong and hearty and loving if it wasn't for both of you. So thank you both so very much.
Thank you, beloved. Thank you for everything.
Yeah.
For everything, Paul. What a delight.
I feel the same. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. We love you. See you next week. Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. Follow me at Aubrey Marcus. Check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere. And leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.